All right. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, as you said, so my name is Nate Anderson. I am our head of strategy at Uber Russia. I have been with Uber since 2014. I previously served as our general manager of East Africa. Before that, I was our head of strategy of the Middle East and Africa. Just to help me understand for everyone that's in the room today, can you just raise your hand if you've heard of Uber before? All right, thank you. And then can you keep your hand raised if you've ever used Uber before? Awesome. And then can you keep it up one more time if you used Uber to get here today? 1, 2. All right. So it means that I still have a lot of work to do in the country. So I think this is super cool, what you guys are doing here this week. I got to hear a little bit of the hackathon and in terms of the vision of trying to make advancements on autonomous technology. Obviously, this is something that Uber has and will continue to invest a lot in over the coming years. And for today's presentation, I want to talk to you guys about the future of urban mobility. And so it's not going to be directly related to what a lot of you guys are doing right now on the self-driving tech hackathon, but should hopefully provide a lot of context into why making technological advancements in this area are going to be very important to making our cities better and advancing urban mobility as we know it today. And so I think to start it off, like the shocking statistic that we need to bring to the forefront is that there's over 1 billion cars in the world. That's the equivalent of the US and Europe combined in terms of population. And what this means are like that we that with this many cars, it's not the fact that we have so many cars, it's how we use them. And if you think about car ownership, it's really directed towards private use. Next time you stop at a red light, I would encourage you to look to your left and to your right and see how many people are in the car next to you. And more often than not, it's usually only one person, the driver. And despite this, in the private use of cars really come at a very large public cost. The first part is just massive lost productivity. In Los Angeles and Sydney, it shows that up to 2 full working weeks are lost every year just sitting in traffic. In Mexico City, it's even higher, up to 5 working weeks. Now, this is time when you're in traffic that obviously you're not at work, you're not at home, you're not with friends and family. And so there's a massive stress that's caused there as well. And then there's obviously the environmental impact, right? Studies show that over 20% of all carbon emissions come from transportation. And so when we think about the types of problems we're solving here in terms of the environment and productivity, it's absolutely massive. And that's only a very small part of the problem. Cars sit idle 95% of the time. So those 1 billion cars all over the world are doing nothing for 95% of the time that you have it. What this means is that we need to find places to store all of these hunks of steel, right? And for most of our major cities, we actually dedicate up to 30% of the city to store vehicles. We have skyscrapers dedicated towards housing vehicles. This means that instead of homes or parks or schools, we have parking lots. I think the other issue about in addition, now in the US, we actually have 8 parking spots for every single car. So it's not equal in terms of car and parking spots. I think the other thing too is that a lot of times many cities actually encourage instead of discourage parking in cities. For a lot of cities, when you go to open a commercial building, you actually have requirements on how many parking spots you need to have based on the size of the building that you're putting up. And I think as we look at even today and for sure into the future, we're being forced to add additional parking spots in our cities that may or may not be needed. And then further going on city design, even cities that have really good design or really well-developed public transportation, this is New York City, there's still a need many times for private car ownership. Like, let's be honest, that the subway in New York City won't go to everyone's doorstep. And that's why 2.7 million cars have to drive into Manhattan every single day. And what this means is that a lot of families get forced into buying vehicles and all of the costs that go along with it. A lot of times it affects lower income families more often, because if you want to have a house or an apartment, either walking distance from your job or walking distance from a very large metro or subway station, it costs more money. And so you end up forcing more and more people to buy vehicles for individual use. And a lot of these problems were nowhere near on the mind of our Uber founders when they first created the company. Like, the story of creating the company was like extremely simple. They wanted to push a button and get a ride. In fact, when Uber first started, it didn't even start as a company. It started as a private service for just the founders and their friends. It was like a closed loop system in San Francisco where it was only cars for them and 100 of their closest friends and family. So it wasn't until Uber started really kicking off and getting a lot larger and becoming more and more a part of the cities that they were in, where a lot of these city transportation infrastructure insufficiencies and inefficiencies became more well known. And it wasn't until actually much later in Uber's lifetime where Uber stepped forward and said that, hey, Uber wants to be a part of the solution into helping change urban mobility in the cities that we're in. And so what I want to talk about now are some of the ways that Uber's currently looking at helping being part of the solution. The first has to do with geographic coverage. And so this is a map of Southern California, and over the years, how the geo coverage reliability increased throughout that region. And I think the key point here is, over the years now, pretty much wherever you are in the city, you're able to push a button and get a car, a lot of times within 10 minutes or less. When you look at Moscow, we had extremely similar results. That as we became more a part of the city and invested more and more into being in Moscow and other cities in Russia, not only did you have that geographical coverage, but also that reliability with timing. Things like dynamic pricing, you might know it more as surge pricing. Essentially what that does is make sure that whenever you need a car, you'll be able to get one, whether it's really bad weather or you're leaving a football match. The idea is that you're always matching supply and demand. There's a lot of research that's been done on how technology has also enabled helping the underserved areas. With Uber and a lot of other rideshare companies, there isn't destination discrimination. In terms of, you request a car, your destination's already part of that trip, and so you can get dropped off no matter where you live in the city. And so this is Paris, and it just shows that the Uber trips had equal or very similar coverage in underserved areas as also as wealthier areas. And then I think the last part is that with Uber, it's a very, very strong opinion that ride sharing needs to be a complement to public transportation. And so this is a map of London, and all of the white dots are different train station stops. Actually, 30% of rides in London either start or end near a tube station. And so what this shows is that people on the outskirts of London are using Uber to get to the train station, to take the train to go into the city, or taking the train out of the city and then using Uber for that last mile transportation. But it's more than just reliability, whether it's geographical or timing. The next stage is really affordability. And how can you make sure that despite having really good coverage and reliability, you can make rides cheap enough for everyone to afford them? And we realize that one person in one car is not always going to get there. And again, like, as Uber continued to grow, we started to see this phenomenon where when you started getting thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands, millions of requests in certain cities in a given day, you'd start to have a lot of simultaneous requests occur, where people were requesting from the same location or a similar location, going to the same destination at the exact same time. And that's the idea of how Uber Pool started back in 2014. And so we said that how can we get more people into fewer cars? And I think the biggest worry we had when we were starting to create Uber Pool was this question of, would people be willing to share a car with a stranger? And the answer ended up being a resounding yes. So this is a map of San Francisco, and these are our traffic patterns on total Uber trips, and then after the launch of Uber Pool. In San Francisco, up to 50% of people are choosing to share a car with a stranger because they're valuing affordability and convenience over anything else. And so what we've seen is, especially on very main busy lines, that we can fit 1, 2, sometimes 3, 4 people inside the same car, no problem, because there's so many simultaneous requests happening in those more densely populated areas. In fact, Uber Pool across the world now in our different pool cities, we actually see over 20% of people globally that will opt for Pool. So talking about some of the results since launching Uber Pool, these are from 2016. We've taken over 500 million kilometers off the road from sharing that same ride. That's way longer than the distance between Earth and Mars. Additionally, there's been obviously a ton of liters of fuel saved, 9 Olympic swimming pools worth. And then going back to the first stat we talked about was reducing the carbon footprint, or reducing carbon emissions. And so we saw over 50,000 tons of CO2 saved by sharing those rides. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about this as well in terms of like where do we go next, or what does that future hold, a lot of times it has to go with this perception or this idea that everyone needs to own a car. And we talked about in the beginning, a lot of times cities will force us or like structurally make it difficult for us to not have individual car ownership. I think what we're getting really excited about is that we're starting to see that trend change. First, back in the day, owning the car was a massive status symbol in many parts of the world. Some parts it still is. Other times too, you needed it just for pure convenience. And I think what we're seeing, at least in the US, are that riders are more resistant to just purchasing a car. And it's not as important of a status symbol anymore. And I think we're finding with public transportation, with a lot of ride sharing and other types of alternatives that help people get around cities, like bike sharing as well, that we can really start to reduce the dependency and the needs for cars and car ownership. And when you look at how a ride-sharing company like Uber is set up to be part of the solution, actually 4% of all miles or kilometers driven globally today are done through ride-sharing companies like Uber and other companies. This number is actually expected, according to Morgan Stanley, to get up to 25% of all miles driven by 2030. And so when you think of companies that are going to be well-positioned in terms of helping solve some of these city infrastructure problems, this is where ride-sharing companies become extremely interesting and attractive. And so what I want to show you guys next is one of our self-driving car videos from Pittsburgh. And so unfortunately there's no sound or voiceover in here, but I can talk to you guys a little bit about it. So we started our self-driving efforts in 2015. We have a very large advanced technology center in Pittsburgh in the US. We've started to pop up other satellite locations and other locations in the US and are looking obviously for more investment there globally. We think it's super interesting. This is one of our big bets, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about it more in the Q&A. But you'll see Uber, like many of the top tech companies around the world, whether it's Google, Apple, Tesla, Yandex, etc., they're all investing in self-driving technology because these companies realize that this is where the future is going. And we talk about like the next type of game-changing technology. This is where it's going to be. All right, the video is almost over. I think, perfect. So I think like when it gets to that kicker is like where does self-driving become interesting, especially in the lens of ride sharing? It becomes interesting because right now we're estimating you could reduce the number of cars up to 90% that are needed if you have self-driving technology on the road. And there's a lot of reasons why, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A, but that's, I think, why we're so excited. And that's why I'm excited that you guys are here at this hackathon and that you're just seeing more and more people investing in this type of advancement. And so I guess like in closing, when you have a number like 90% of cars that you can take off the road, like we talked about the types of productivity that's lost when you're stuck in traffic, or obviously the impact you could have on the environment in terms of reducing carbon emissions or congestion, but also when you think of the city. Like the fact that we have up to 30% of our cities dedicated towards parking is absolutely crazy. And so we actually have a saying where we say that self-driving technology is our way that helps cities change their parking lots back to parks. And so that's what this photo represents, and that's kind of an overall mission of why Uber is investing in this area. So thank you guys very much. Cool. So I have, I think, a pretty fair amount of time for Q&A. So any questions?
Do you think the willingness or the readiness of people to share rides with strangers depends on... Sorry. Do you think the willingness or readiness of people to share cars rides with strangers would depend on cultural backgrounds, or it's only connected with the geographical stratification of cities? For example, would a lot of people be willing in Russia to share rides with strangers?
It's a great question. I don't know if I'm going to be the right person to answer the question about would people in Russia be willing to share. Obviously, it's something that's pretty easy for us to test, and I don't know, maybe I'll ask the audience, like, would you guys share an Uber pool, yes or no? Raise your hand if it's yes, assuming it's up to 50% cheaper. I use all this. All right. So I'm feeling really good about that. So I think yes, but I think it also calls out a really good thing, or a really important point is like every city we've gone to, so much of it is devoted to understanding what do we have to do to localize a product, and what cultural elements are super important that need to stay very local, and what ones are more global things. And I think luckily with things like transportation, like affordability and reliability just come out as such the most important things right now that a lot of times it will be more important than other factors that come up. Thanks.
Давайте начнем, наверное, с этого угла. There were a lot of those who wanted to ask. No, I'm mistaken. Questions?
По-русски можно задать вопрос? Вы говорили о экологической проблеме. Можно?
Okay, I can hear now. So.
Вот, вы говорили об экологической проблеме. Будет ли Uber стараться использовать автомобили на газовых двигателях, использовать газ, что более экологично, или более совершенные двигатели, электродвигатели, которые вообще не загрязняют окружающую среду? Спасибо.
Thank you for the question. So the question was around concerning Uber is invested in the environment, are we going to continue using it? Like, how do we encourage the transition from petrol cars to electric cars, or more sustainable fuel alternatives? So again, it's very different depending on the countries that we're in each one. I think the first point is that Uber is really just the technology company, the platform that connects riders and drivers. And so right now, when drivers come on the platform, there's different vehicle requirements and obviously driver requirements that enable someone to drive on the Uber platform and accept ride requests on there. What we have done in a lot of different cities, both in Europe, we've done them in Africa, also too in a few US cities, we've created like Uber green options. And so there's specific vehicle views that are dedicated either to only all electric vehicles or all hybrid ones. And we offer this as an alternative for riders that say, hey, I only want to ride in an electric vehicle. Now, Uber has not taken a stance yet in any city to say, hey, we're only going to offer electric vehicles, and part of that has to do with the reliability, and there just wouldn't be enough cars at the moment to satisfy all of the demand in the city, should there have been that hard of a line drawn in the sand. But it's definitely something that I think we also need to partner with the cities and countries that we operate in to help push that agenda. And what we've seen now are a lot of cities and countries actually say after a certain year that they're going to stop allowing petrol-based cars on the road. And I think those are the cities that are going to have very forward-looking agendas that would also want to encourage things like carpooling. And again, where Uber can be more part of the solution and work with the cities on there, as opposed to driving the agenda purely from a single company. Thank you.
Тут был вопрос, я тогда следующий передам вам. Следующий будет за вами.
Thank you. Have you ever considered a service like a bike ride? It could be, it could look like a more risky travel, but it could avoid the traffic jams. So, is it an option?
To do an Uber bike ride. Just a quick follow-up. You mean like actually hop on someone else's bicycle or a motorcycle? Yeah, but like a gas-powered bike or with pedals?
No, gas-powered.
Gas-powered. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we actually we do that in a few countries. So in a lot of our Southeast Asian countries, we do have Uber Moto. Is what it's called, and it is, it's a two-wheeled motorcycle that does absolutely, you're right, you get past traffic with it because you go in between the lanes. Now there's a ton of very interesting things from a safety perspective that need to be taken into account. Obviously, just in general, motorcycles have a much higher incident rate for accidents. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that Uber and other type companies don't want to go into that space, because we can do a lot of things with the technology to actually make that ride more safe. Chances are it'll still be less safe than a car. So we do have it live. Our value proposition in those countries where it is available today is very much on the safety angle, and how can you make sure that the driver is wearing a helmet, that we have helmets available for passengers should they choose to wear them. We actually changed our application, the driver application, so it's easier to do when on a motorcycle, because you don't want a driver to be distracted and only have one hand while steering. But it is super interesting. Actually, when I was in East Africa, when I was the GM there, we looked at launching it both in Nairobi and Kampala, and we haven't made that decision yet, but we're actively looking there. It's a super, super interesting way to be part of the city and help match with what riders want, with what we can help enable and provide. So. But no plans for Moscow or Russia right now, so sorry.
Greetings. First of all, excuse me for my pronunciation and lack of vocabulary. So my question is, does Uber in the future planning to cooperate with other global companies like Google, for example, Tesla cars, something like that? Thank you.
In terms of like autonomous vehicles, or in terms of?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's super interesting. I think in the beginning, the assumption was, yes, it'd be like all one big collaboration. I think realistically, and this is me speaking on behalf of Nate and not on behalf of Uber here, I think what you've seen is every company has now really started investing in their own technology. And I think what people realize is that, you know, self-driving technology is just so powerful, and there's so many implications, right, to like the first company or companies that really get it right, that people really want to own that technology themselves. And because it's going to just be absolutely fundamentally change any business that is first to market on there. So unfortunately, I think all the companies will likely be a bit closed off, right? And they're all going to try to recruit the best talent, the best young engineers to come to their companies to help them be the first to have like real self-driving cars on the road. And hopefully, if there's not necessarily as much collaboration between the companies, hopefully the competitiveness between all the companies will help get us to a solution really, really quickly. And then from there, I think it'll become, you know, more widespread.
Thank you.
Еще есть ли у кого вопросы? I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nate. Guys, please don't leave, because in several minutes, about 10, I suppose, we're going to start the next lecture of Timur Poltashov. You're ready? Okay, then Timur is starting right now. Yeah, and okay, we're starting right now with the next lecture by Timur Poltashov, who is the Chief Technical Officer of Radeon Technology Group AMD, the partner of our event.